In 2018, Florida wildlife officials did something that seemed completely insane. They captured 328 beavers from overpopulated areas and released them onto 15,000 acres of completely barren wetland in the Panhandle. No trees, no vegetation, just dead, cracked earth that had been drained for agriculture decades earlier and abandoned when the soil turned toxic. Environmental groups called it a waste of money. Biologists said the beavers would starve or migrate away within weeks. Local ranchers predicted the beavers would destroy what little remaining land value existed. Everyone agreed it was a stupid idea destined to fail catastrophically. 6 years later, those 15,000 acres are unrecognizable. And what happened is now being called the most successful ecological restoration project in Florida history. This is the story of how an animal that shouldn't survive without trees transformed dead land into a thriving wetland ecosystem, and why scientists are now copying this exact strategy across the world. Let me paint you a picture of what this land looked like in 2018. The area is in the Florida Panhandle near the Apalachicola River. In the 1950s, it was pristine wetland, cypress swamps, hardwood forests, meandering streams full of fish. Drained the wetlands with a network of ditches and planted crops. The drainage worked too well. The water table dropped 15 feet. The organic rich wetland soil dried out and oxidized, releasing decades of stored carbon and becoming acidic. Crops failed after 20 years because the soil was exhausted. The corporations abandoned the land in the 1980s. You could walk across this land and not see a single tree. Not one. The ditches had carved the land into geometric sections. The ground was hard-packed clay mixed with dead organic matter. During rain, water rushed through the ditches into the river without soaking into the soil. During drought, the land turned to dust. Nothing grew except sparse invasive grasses. No birds nested there. No amphibians bred there. Aerial surveys found almost zero wildlife. The state of Florida owned it, 14,782 acres of ecologically dead land that cost money to maintain and provided zero value. Restoration seemed impossible. Reflooding it would require building expensive water control structures and decades of waiting for vegetation to return naturally. The projected cost was $87 million over 30 years with no guarantee of success. Then somebody had a ridiculous idea: let beavers do the work. The insane plan: release beavers with nothing to eat. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a restoration ecologist with Florida Fish and Wildlife, proposed something that sounded like ecological suicide. Take beavers, animals that require trees for food and building materials, and release them onto land with zero trees. Let them figure it out. Her reasoning was based on beaver behavior research from the 1990s. When beavers can't find trees, they don't just give up and die. They adapt. They build dams using whatever materials are available. Grass, sticks, scavenged from miles away, even invasive vegetation. Those dams trap water. Trapped water allows vegetation to grow. Growing vegetation provides food for beavers. The beavers then expand their dams and create more wetland. But here's the critical insight Martinez had: beavers aren't just dam builders. They're ecosystem engineers. One beaver family doesn't just affect one area. They trigger cascading effects across entire watersheds. If you release enough beavers across strategically chosen points, they'll create interconnected wetlands that restore themselves. The plan was to capture 300+ beavers from areas where they were overpopulated. They were causing property damage by flooding roads and farms, and relocate them to the dead zone. No supplemental food, no artificial water sources. Just release them and see what happens. The budget was $680,000, mostly for beaver trapping, transport, and 2 years of monitoring. Compared to the $87 million traditional restoration plan, it was basically free. But everyone thought it would fail spectacularly. Florida approved the project in April 2018. By August, 328 beavers had been released in 47 different locations across the 15,000 acres. Then came the waiting. Month 1 cut. 3. This is going exactly as predicted terribly. For the first 3 months, the critics seemed right. Aerial surveys in September 2018 showed that roughly 40% of the beavers had migrated away from the release sites. Trail cameras caught beavers wandering, clearly looking for better habitat. Several were found dead, likely from heat stress or inability to find food. The beavers that stayed did build dams, but they were pathetic. Crude piles of mud and grass barely 2 feet high in the drainage ditches. Most collapsed within days when water flowed through. The dams that survived created tiny puddles maybe 30 feet across that evaporated within a week. By October 2018, environmental groups were calling for the project to be shut down. They claimed it was animal cruelty to starve beavers on unsuitable land. Local media ran stories about another government boondoggle wasting taxpayer money. Martinez and her team were getting crucified in public meetings. But then something started happening that nobody expected. Month 4-8, the first signs that something was working, November 2018 through February 2019, was Florida's dry season. This is when the project should have completely failed. No rain means no water, and beavers need water to survive. But trail cameras started recording something strange. The beavers weren't building dams in the drainage ditches anymore. They'd figured out that water flowed too fast through those. Instead, they were building dams at the low points between ditches, places where water naturally pooled during rain. These weren't big dams, maybe 3 or 4 feet high, but they were strategically placed to capture every drop of water that fell. And here's where it gets interesting. When the first major rainstorm hit in December 2018, those small dams captured and held water that normally would have rushed into the river and disappeared. The puddles that had been 30 feet across in October were now 200 feet across in January. And they weren't evaporating because the dams were holding depth. The standing water did something critical. Seeds that had been dormant in the soil for decades, seeds from the original wetland vegetation that had survived underground, began germinating. By February 2019, monitoring teams were finding patches of wetland plants around the beaver ponds. Sedges, rushes, even a few willow saplings. The beavers immediately started eating them. And here's the crucial part. They weren't eating all of them. Beavers are selective feeders. They cut some plants for food and dam building material, but they leave others alone. The plants they left alone continued growing. The plants they cut regenerated from roots. Many wetland plants are adapted to this kind of disturbance. By March 2019, 8 months after release, the surviving beaver population had stabilized at around 215 individuals. They'd organized into 47 distinct family groups, each maintaining dams at their chosen locations. And those dams were starting to actually work. Year 2, the cascade effect begins. This is where the story gets wild. Spring 2019 brought heavy rainfall, and those 47 beaver dams trapped enormous volumes of water that would normally have drained away. The ponds expanded from a few hundred feet across to quarter-mile-wide wetlands behind the larger dams. But beavers kept building. They raised their dams higher and extended them wider. A 3-foot dam in January became a 7-foot dam by May. Ponds merged as water backed up behind interconnected dams. The largest dam, built by what researchers called the Alpha colonies, stretched 450 feet across and created a 14-acre pond. That 14-acre pond did something remarkable. It raised the water table for hundreds of yards in every direction. The hard-packed clay soil slowly rehydrated. The ditches that had drained the area started backing up as beaver dams blocked their flow. Water that had been rushing to the river now spread horizontally across the land, and the vegetation exploded. By July 2019, satellite imagery showed green patches covering approximately 30% of areas within 500 yards of beaver ponds. The vegetation wasn't just wetland grasses anymore. Willows were growing 10 to 15 feet tall. Wax myrtles were sprouting. Buttonbush appeared in dense thickets. Cypress seedlings, which everyone thought were extinct from the area, started emerging from soil seed banks. Beavers began cutting these new trees, which gave them proper building materials. The dams transformed from crude mud piles into engineered structures made of interwoven branches, packed mud, and vegetation. These dams were structurally sound. They could handle major water flow without collapsing. The wildlife returned. By fall 2019, bird surveys found 47 species using the restored wetlands, species that had been completely absent from the area for decades. Wading birds like herons and egrets were feeding in the shallow ponds. Ducks started showing up during migration. Ospreys nested in the tallest dead trees that still stood from the original forest. Amphibian surveys were even more dramatic. In 2018, researchers found basically zero frogs or salamanders. By late 2019, they were documenting massive breeding populations of at least 8 species. The beaver ponds created perfect amphibian habitat, shallow water with abundant vegetation. Year 3, 4. The wetland that shouldn't exist. By 2021, 3 years after release, the transformation was undeniable. The 47 original beaver colonies had expanded to 83 colonies. The beaver population was now estimated at 340 net 360 individuals, more than were originally released, which meant they were successfully breeding, and the wetlands were self-sustaining. This is the critical milestone. The beavers no longer needed to build dams from scratch. They were maintaining and expanding existing dams. The vegetation was thick enough that beavers had abundant food year-round. The ponds were deep enough to survive dry seasons without completely evaporating. Aerial surveys in 2022 showed that approximately 6,200 acres, 42% of the original 15,000-acre dead zone, had been converted to functional wetland. Not restored to original pristine condition, but converted from ecological desert into working wetland with water retention, diverse vegetation, and abundant wildlife. The largest beaver dam complex, maintained by descendants of that original alpha colony, was now creating a 78-acre wetland. That single dam held back enough water to rehydrate hundreds of surrounding acres. The area around it had transformed from barren clay to dense marsh with 12-foot-tall vegetation. Alligators moved into the larger ponds. River otters followed the beavers and established their own populations. Bobcats were spotted hunting along the wetland edges. The economic value changed dramatically, too. In 2018, the land was essentially worthless. By 2022, the restored wetlands were providing documented ecosystem services worth an estimated $4.7 million annually. Flood control through water retention, water quality improvement through filtration, carbon sequestration in regenerating vegetation and organic soil, wildlife habitat supporting commercial and recreational species. And it costs $680,000 to achieve. The traditional restoration approach would have spent $87 million and still be in the early stages. The Beavers did it in 4 years for less than 1% of the cost. Year 5, 6. Scientists start freaking out by 2023 to 2024. Word got out, and researchers from around the world started coming to study what happened. Because what Florida accidentally discovered was a restoration technique that works in situations where traditional methods fail. The key insight: beavers don't just build dams. They create positive feedback loops. Dams trap water. Water allows plants to grow. Plants provide food and building materials. More materials mean better dams. Better dams trap more water. The cycle accelerates and becomes self-sustaining once it reaches critical mass. But here's what really shocked scientists. The beavers did this without trees. Everyone thought beavers required existing forests to survive. Florida proved that beavers can bootstrap an entire ecosystem from basically nothing if you give them enough space and enough individuals to establish breeding populations. Studies published in 2023 documented the specific mechanisms: soil regeneration. Beaver ponds trap sediment and organic matter. The dead clay soil was being buried under inches of rich, organic mud. Soil samples from 2024 showed carbon content had increased 340% in areas near beaver ponds compared to 2018 baseline. The soil was coming back to life. Hydrological recovery. The water table had risen 12 feet across the entire area. Groundwater monitoring wells showed that water levels were approaching pre-drainage conditions from the 1940s. The beavers had essentially reversed 70 years of hydrological damage in 6 years. Biodiversity explosion. By 2024, the species count was staggering. 127 bird species documented versus 12 in 2018, 34 mammal species versus 3 in 2018, 18 reptile and amphibian species versus 0 in 2018. The restored wetlands were supporting biodiversity levels comparable to undisturbed natural areas. And the beavers kept expanding. The population in 2024 was estimated at 410 mice, 450 individuals maintaining over 100 active dams. The wetland coverage had reached approximately 8,300 acres, 56% of the original area. At current rates, projections suggested 80 to 85% coverage by 2030. Why this changes everything about ecological restoration. Here's why scientists are freaking out. This shouldn't have worked. Every established principle of ecological restoration says you need to restore conditions first, then introduce animals. You rebuild hydrology, plant vegetation, wait for soil to recover, and only then bring back wildlife. Florida did it backwards. They introduced animals to a dead zone and let the animals create the conditions. And it worked better and faster than the proper method would have. The implications are enormous. There are millions of acres of degraded wetlands worldwide that are considered too damaged or too expensive to restore using traditional methods. Florida just proved that introducing ecosystem engineers like beavers can restore these areas for a fraction of the cost and in a fraction of the time. Countries are already copying this. The UK started a similar project in 2023, releasing beavers onto degraded agricultural land. Australia is researching whether introduced beavers could restore damaged billabongs. They don't have native beavers, which is controversial. Even China is studying whether this approach could restore damaged Yellow River wetlands. The technical term is rewilding through keystone species reintroduction. The practical term is letting beavers fix our mess because they're better at it than we are. The present day walking through a wetland that didn't exist 6 years ago in 2024, you can walk through those 15,000 acres and not recognize them as the same barren dead zone from 2018. Where there was cracked clay, there are now cypress trees 20 feet tall. Where there were empty ditches, there are meandering streams full of fish. Where there was silence, there are bird calls, frog choruses, and the sound of water flowing over beaver dams. The main dam built by the Alpha Colony, which started as a 3-foot mud pile in 2018, is now a 12-foot tall, 600-foot-long engineered structure that would cost millions of dollars to build with human labor. The beavers maintain it continuously, repairing any damage within days. And the best part, the project is basically over. The beavers are self-sustaining. The wetlands are self-maintaining. Florida spends about $40,000 per year monitoring the site, but the beavers don't need human intervention anymore. They're doing exactly what beavers evolved to do: building dams, creating wetlands, and supporting ecosystems. The total cost from 2018 to 2024, approximately $1.1 million, including monitoring and research. The result, 8,300 acres of functional wetland, providing millions of dollars in ecosystem services annually and supporting biodiversity that had been locally extinct for decades. Florida released hundreds of beavers onto dead land with 0 trees because it seemed like the only option left after conventional restoration failed. Nobody expected it to work. But nature has been doing this for millions of years, long before humans invented ecological restoration plans. Sometimes the best way to fix a broken ecosystem is to reintroduce the animals that evolved to create that ecosystem in the first place. Then get out of their way and let them work.